Well, it's hard to believe that Australia may never get the Port of Darwin back from Beijing. A review by Defence has found, quote unquote, no reason, including on the grounds of a risk to national security, to overturn the 99-year lease. This decision is baffling given the current soaring hostilities between China and Australia. Well, to take us through this decision and its impact is former DFAT Australia China Council scholar, medtech entrepreneur and independent China watcher, Andrew Phelan. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Good to be with you, Caleb. I echo your sentiment. I'm also quite perplexed by this finding. In fact, at the time, back in 2015, when the deal was done, given that it's our only North Coast port, I couldn't believe that we'd done this deal. Of course, Adam Giles was the then Chief Minister of the Territory, and he did the deal with Landbridge, which is a company that was subsequently found in Chinese language materials to have very close ties with the People's Liberation Army. And at the time, Chief Minister Giles had said, well, we'll look into that. But of course, at that stage, the ink was dry and the contract had been signed. So I guess what that episode illustrates is that at a subnational level, be it at state government level or local government level, we need to educate our people a lot better. And this is not a case of Liberal or Labor. This is something of national importance where we really need bipartisanship on understanding China.
But what's really going on here? Is this Defence not wanting to escalate tensions further between Beijing and Australia?
I think you're onto something there, given the timing of the announcement. It's odd, isn't it, that it should come between Christmas and New Year's. But if you look at what China's doing around the world, and of course, our relations with China are at the prickliest they've ever been, but we're one of pretty much the whole Western world that's in the same boat at the moment. In fact, Canada's about to make a call on Huawei, and President Trudeau has just said that China is picking off Western democracies and playing them against each other, and that we need to come together. Interesting comment. But back to ports and shipping, China owns a lot of ports around the world. Piraeus in Greece, for example, the Mediterranean. They did have a majority ownership of the port of Long Beach in California, which is the largest container port in North America. Subsequently, the Americans moved on that. It's now majority owned by Macquarie, actually. But in addition to owning ports, China also has two very large merchant shipping, state-owned shipping companies, China Merchants and COSCO. And so to kind of connect the dots here, we tend to think in Australia of commercial deals and military. We tend to separate the two. Chinese thinking is a little different to that. They tend to think in terms of civil-military fusion and what are the synergies and combinations. And of course, you don't have to look too far back to a terrible example of the weaponization of civilian transport, of course, in 9/11. But there's been another case just recently in the UAE where COSCO was involved on a port, and the Americans told their Emirati allies to tell the Chinese to stop that building on that port because they sensed that it had a dual use function. There was a military application going on as well. And of course, the Emiratis complied with that. The other thing that came up just recently was that it was discovered that China has been working on a long-range cruise missile that could be launched from a container ship. So you combine all these factors together. I am perplexed with this finding. I know it's not final, but it doesn't sit well with me.
Well, that's the obvious issue, isn't it? I mean, if you've got a major strategic asset like the Port of Darwin that you've handed over to China, a country which we are having, something of a trade war with at the moment, a country that we know is militarising in the South China Sea, is spending money like nobody's business in the Pacific around us, and we've basically given them somewhere to operate in and out of. Ultimately, they can do what they want there. If push comes to shove, how much can we actually do to stop them?
Yeah, it's a great question, Caleb. The two things for China are power and leverage. That's what matters to China. And China's the big kid on the block, so it's throwing its weight around. You might have seen an article in the Australian today referring to fisticuffs in Fiji at a diplomatic function where to commemorate relations with Taiwan. 2 representatives from the PRC showed up and beat the lights out of a Taiwanese delegate who ended up in hospital. And this is one of a bunch of occurrences that have happened in other places. When President Moon of South Korea was here a week or 2 ago, he on a similar visit in China a couple of years ago, some of his press handlers were beaten up. We've seen the consulate in Brisbane send thugs down to rough up some of the students there, Drew Pavlou included. And some of the rhetoric that's been coming out of Xi Jinping, famously he said in Kathmandu a couple of years ago with regard to Hong Kong that we would break bones and show no mercy. And he kept good on that promise because they sent a group of well-known triad thugs down to one of the subway stations. They made no attempt to hide it, by the way. These guys were wearing white T-shirts and they had sticks. And they proceeded to beat people over the head. And the police didn't show up. So China does have a tendency, not having an independent judiciary and not having the rule of law, does have a tendency, as a recent Harvard working paper has stated, to exhibit mafia-like tendencies, bully boy tendencies. And anyone who's done business in the trenches of commerce in China, I think you know what I would be talking about.
What a surprise from a communist country. Just very quickly, mate, on trade tensions, things are continuing to escalate with China via the World Trade Organization. What's happening there?
Yeah, there's an interesting quote from the Chinese to say that it's normal for Chinese importers to make decisions on whether and where to purchase, on market conditions, blah, blah, blah. Of course, that's a load of rubbish. This is pure and utter trade coercion. So I think Australia's done the right thing. And, to a certain extent, the government has been hammered by the opposition on this. Matt Thistlethwaite said the other day that, it's the duty of the government to maintain sound relations with China. Well, it is to an extent when China's also playing its role according to the international rules. And when Australia's being bullied and forced to, take Huawei into a 5G network and so on, then you would expect the government to stand up for the national interest. And I think the government has been doing that and doing it very well. But this is going to be a real test for the WTO and every UN-related multilateral, I should say, has been to a large extent influenced by China. And it's got the numbers. And the WTO has a new Nigerian head, Ngozi Okonjo, who's a very smart, very sophisticated lady, spent a lot of time in the US. So this is going to be a real test case for whether the WTO can handle this kind of dispute. And not just here in Australia and all the stakeholders, but all around the world, people will be watching how this goes down with keen interest.
Andrew, thank you for joining us on Inside the News this evening.
Pleasure, Caleb, anytime.